Welcome to Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode, we're going to be speaking to Laura Dodsworth. Before I introduce Laura, though, let me just say a huge thank you to all of our supporters at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Thanks to you guys, this episode was made possible. Now, if you're not already a member of our patron community, you can join us right now for as little as $1 a month or as much as you'd like to contribute at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Not only will you be helping to ensure that more of this great content keeps getting made, but if you support us with $5 or more per month, you will get exclusive access to an extra 4 to 5 patron-only episodes of our audio podcast, The Dispatches, every single month. So there you go, a great return on your investment in this humble but growing independent media venture. Right, now back to our guest. Laura Dodsworth is a journalist, filmmaker and author from the United Kingdom. Along with the several books she has already authored, Laura has also written for the Sunday Times, the Telegraph, the Mail on Sunday, the Guardian and also Spiked. Her latest book, A State of Fear, How the UK Government Weaponised Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic, was a Sunday Times bestseller. The book details how fear was leveraged to encourage compliance during an extraordinary period in human history and politics, with stories from members of the general public and revealing interviews with psychologists, politicians, scientists, lawyers, Whitehall advisors, and also journalists. It's been called an important book, a chilling post-mortem, and dark and compelling. So without any further ado, let's have this important conversation with Laura Dodsworth about the government use of fear during the pandemic and what can be done to improve transparency and create a more effective democracy in times of crisis in the future. Laura, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today to have this conversation. Well, a conversation that I think actually is profoundly important. Let's start at the beginning. Before we unpack some of the themes in your book, what was it that actually motivated you to write the book? What was it that made you say, I've got to write this book? There's a story here that must be told and it's worthy of being put to print.
Yeah, I'm always asked this, and in a way I kind of flounder a little bit because when I say that for me the big story last year was fear, I think that still doesn't resonate with a lot of people because the big story seems to be a pandemic and infection and death. But I just felt a lot of fear in the air right from the beginning, right from those early days when lockdown was first implemented, to go outside on my daily walk. And people would just, they'd jump to the side of the path and kind of bury their face in the hedge almost to avoid breathing in my exhalations. You could just feel the fear in the air. And I think however you caught it, you caught fear. There was fear of the virus and infection and death. There was fear of what it might mean for your life, for the changes to your life. Not everyone is the laptop middle classes. Some people lost all their work and their ability to earn an income and earn a living for their family. And of course, there's also been fear of authoritarianism. So I think part of the reason that I tuned into it, me specifically, is I'm always interested in the taboo and the stories and the themes that we tuck away to the back of the darkest closet and try and pretend they're not there. Because another thing people ask me is, how did you get from your previous work to here? Because my previous 3 books were, wait for it, photographing breasts, penises and vulvas, and in each case interviewing 100 people about their relationship with their body. But to understand that work, those photographs are visual signposts through stories of what it means to be a man and a woman and the politics of power and shame, gender, sexuality. So I think I just tuned in from those very personal politics of power and shame to the politics of fear. And that for me is the segue. And do you know what? Increasingly, I'm seeing more stories about behavioural science and fear and propaganda. And I think more people are going to tune into this as the big story because epidemics come and go. Even this really awful pandemic, it will be over. Yes, it will. The variants can't go on forever, okay? But psychology is here to stay. Our basic psychology it's forever. So the story is, how is our psychology leveraged against us? Or is it in our benefit? That's the debate.
Yeah, it was interesting actually. One of the things I found fascinating about the book and I really enjoyed about it was the way that you there was these constant I don't want to call them interjections, that's not the right word, but sort of the framing of your philosophical and political arguments were centered around these constant personal stories from people who actually experienced that fear firsthand and out of the UK. And there was something really important, I think, about that. It really, for me, it reminded me a little bit of my own initial fears and experiences, but it also it really gives a very real narrative context to this. Real lives were impacted by this fear, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was so important to me. So that comes into my previous body of work, where I interview people and I collate, curate, and present their first person testimony. It also chimed with some of the interviews I did. There was a veteran disaster planner I interviewed several times for the book, Lucy Easthope, and she kept reiterating with me that it's not just the numbers, it's the qualitative research, it's the impacts on people's lives, this kind of soft social science that governments were ignoring in their policies. None of this was really being looked at. And for me, it was also a way to kind of flesh out the arguments. I haven't written a political, polemical book before, so I've probably not gone about it in a standard classic way. In fact, I can guarantee I haven't. And putting those first person stories between each chapter were a way for me to keep bringing you back to the personal impact, because each person has, in one way or another, been undone by the campaign of fear, not by the virus, but by the campaign of fear.
Let's talk about now that campaign of fear, because I think this is really the important crux of your book, and it's not just a genius to what you've said. I think it's pulling back the Band-Aid and the mask, if you like, and really challenging people to really explore and examine what the implications of this are. What are some of the examples of fear tactics that have been utilised during this pandemic? Because reading this from New Zealand, you speak from the UK context, but a lot of these things have direct parallels or also happened equally here as well.
Absolutely. And when I wrote it, I didn't know if that would be the case or not, but I suspected it because behavioural science departments are embedded in governments around the world and in the World Health Organization. So it's not surprising that you're going to see similar approaches in different countries. So the tactics of fear, there are so many. I mean, it starts with the initial political speeches and announcements here, which used the language of fear, very martial language. We were at war, we were doing battle. Now, this kind of martial language evokes wartime and therefore danger and violence, but it also provokes an obedient and compliant response. In wartime, you're supposed to suck it up and do your part. You're a soldier now, you're a conscript, there's some suffering, take your rations. So there's a kind of a double purpose in that language. Interestingly, I've just noticed the resurgence of martial language here in the UK. There was advertising. So the UK government had a vast advertising spend. You wouldn't be able to add it up yet because, I don't know, conveniently, they don't announce what they've spent on above and below the line advertising and keep a running total on the COVID dashboard. It's going to be, at some point, somebody will do a whole series of freedom of informations and get it, but it's hundreds of millions. It's huge. The UK government and Public Health England were the biggest advertisers in the media last year. So examples of ads ranged from almost laughably frightening, like "Don't let a cup of coffee cost lives," to an ad, a specific one I remember, which showed some teenage lads in a park, and it said, "COVID kills." Well, COVID does kill, but it's killed very few teenage lads. The implication was that they might kill somebody by being out in a park. And that's what a lot of the advertising did. It deflected away from government and government policy and pointed the finger at you, individual person, citizen. You're at risk and you are the risk. The advertising also sought to democratise the risk. It placed everybody at risk, when in fact we knew from very early on that COVID particularly affects the elderly and people with identifiable clinical conditions. The most common comorbidities and conditions are obesity, overweight, diabetes, type 2, hypertensive disorders, Alzheimer's. They're the main ones off the top of my head. So, a teenage boy is not equally at risk with an 80-year-old. But Exhibit A in my thesis, that government used fear against people in order to encourage compliance, is the SPI-B minutes dating from March 2020. Let me just grab a copy of my book so that I can give you the exact wording. which was: the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. That's from a paper called Options for Increasing Adherence to Social Distancing Measures, and it's by the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour. That's a group of behavioural scientists and social scientists who advised the question. And they didn't just pull that up out of thin air. What they do is they answer questions. So the government has said, how do we make people follow these crazy totalitarian lockdown rules? And there was a suite of suggestions, one of which is increasing people's sense of personal threat, because some people understood the risks to their own particular demographic. And the advertising used methods such as, very close, grainy, desaturated but highly contrasty close-ups of people's faces with oxygen masks on, yellow and black chevron edges, which look a bit like disaster cordons, big red fonts, dramatic language. It was really supposed to elevate that sense of fear, and it was everywhere. Also, the media, there was 24/7 doom mongering in the media. I mean, some of the journalists themselves, they were addicted to fears. There's clickbait headlines. There's a whole chapter on media in the book. But also, behavioural scientists and the government do work with the media. We have that in black and white in other ways. For instance, recently Sky, a broadcaster, and the Behavioural Insights team, which is part-owned by the government, released a joint report where they talk about using behavioural science tactics to nudge behaviour towards net zero. And they talk about influencing news, documentaries, soap operas, advertising. So we know that behavioural scientists and the media work together. The use of statistics. So modelling has been used a lot throughout the pandemic, including to justify that initial lockdown, which also influenced the rest of the world. Now, when modelling is used by politicians in the media, they don't reach for the mid-range projections. They reach for the worst case scenarios, the biggest number, the biggest, steepest, reddest line on the graph, to also instill fear and to soften people up and to gain that compliance for the policy that they want to bring in. As well as fear, there are other tactics like shaming and norming. So in the media, we had a term, COVIDiot. I bet you had a similar one in New Zealand, if not the same. So, and also that's contrasted with the hero. Now, the hero is basically somebody who stays at home and follows the rules to protect the NHS. It's a complete inversion of what we've typically thought of as the hero. The hero would go on a quest and slay a dragon and maybe disobey the king and go off on a big mythic epic saga. But a hero in a pandemic stays at home and does what they're told. The COVIDiot is actually the individual who follows the rules. And sometimes that was applied really cruelly. I remember on Independence Day, that's what we dubbed the day when the pubs reopened, there was this slew of articles showing people on a long lens, so they looked compressed, in the streets, God forbid, enjoying a drink after the pubs reopened. And you had language like selfish moron, COVIDiot, gammon, that's a particular British word for a red-faced, white, right-wing person. I'm not sure what a gammon is. Same with people who went to the beach. Now, we know that the risk of outdoor transmission is tiny. And I think people following their common sense on a bank holiday when deprived of taking an overseas holiday were just going to the beach. But the media coverage of it was really sneering and disapproving and made them look like selfish idiots. And also fines. So we've had some of the most we have had the most punitive fines in the UK for transgressing COVID rules that we have had since the Dark Ages. I researched fines going back through the ages, and basically your fine for breaking self-isolation was about the same as killing a Welshman in the Middle Ages. It was it was the equivalent of what we called blood money, ware money, hundreds of years ago. I mean, one of the fines was £10,000. There were two students who organised a snowball fight in January, and they were fined £10,000 each.
That's unbelievable.
So those fines are supposed to put the fear of God in you. Don't you dare break the rules, or it could break you. You could get a life-destroying fine.
It's an interesting point there too about the fines. We're seeing something similar here in New Zealand. What's interesting is that's happening at the exact same time as you are bringing in more and more of these sort of draconian rules that are actually, they're unenforceable because they're not policeable. You don't have enough police officers to police all of this at the same time as you introduce these absurd fines, as if they have any meaning beyond just the scare tactic, right?
Yeah, well, you know, that's tapping into a really interesting point. So you will probably see videos in the media that show police officers arresting and finding a transgressor. Okay, there's an element to that which is almost like a psyop, because not everybody who breaks the rules is going to have a police officer around the call ready to fine them, but they want you to see that. Okay, because that's the fear. It's the fear of breaking the rule and the punishment, and that's what it's all carrot and stick. The fine is the stick.
Tell us a little bit a bit about these nudge units, because I'd never heard of this before. Apparently they are actually a child of the United Kingdom, and we have one right here in New Zealand, our capital city, where our parliament and our politicians and bureaucrats are. We have a nudge unit here. What is the nudge unit, and why should we be concerned about that?
Why, of course you have a nudge unit. We have exported nudge units around the world, don't you know? So the nudge unit was set up under the Conservative government, under David Cameron. And to start with, it was just part of the Cabinet Office. And it was a team of behavioural scientists headed up by David Halpern. And then that became, well, they call themselves independent. But I don't really know how you can call a company which is 1/3 owned by the cabinet independent. So it's commonly called the Nudge Unit, but it's officially the Behavioural Insights team. And they have set up offices around the world, but also what they've done is second staff to other governments to help them to set up departments. So I don't know the history and the provenance of your own, but you may very well have had a British behavioural scientist on secondment there to help you set up. And I think it's another reason why you see a consistency of approach. So behavioural science is all about changing your behaviour. That's a key thing to understand. It is about how you behave. It's not about how you feel. It's about how to make you stand on the dot in the supermarket. It's about how to make you stay in your house instead of go out and see your lover or do your job or worship in your church. It is not about how you feel about it at all, except where your feelings come into play with your behaviour. A nudge shouldn't be a mandate. A nudge is about choice architecture. So a classic example of a nudge would be putting fruit at eye level in the supermarket. A nudge would not be taxing sugar, for instance.
So tell me about that. What's because some people would say, well, what's the big deal here? It's just a little nudge, isn't it? It's even got a friendly sounding name.
Absolutely. And I think there is absolutely an argument about that. I mean, I've become quite anti-nudge in the course of researching my book, but I think we'll all be on a spectrum ideologically and politically with how different methods of governance sit with us. So if I put my eyes on the horizon, what do I want society to be like? Well, if we think about the epidemic, I would have liked the government to call on qualities like virtue, courage, and personal responsibility, and not to use fear in order to encourage compliance. I would like to have a mature relationship with my government where they give me the information and then I make decisions about how to behave and what to do. I don't really want these grey cardinals embedded within governments coming up with subliminal methods of how to manipulate our behaviour, because that's the thing about nudge. It's subliminal. It seeks to affect your choices without you really being aware. I think there's something about nudge which is very paternalistic. It doesn't see you as a rational human being that's going to make decisions for yourself or even good decisions. And what's alarmed me during the epidemic management, it's the first time I woke up to nudge, is that it's not just one nudge. They don't just nudge you once, they keep nudging you till they get the behaviour they want, and then you move on to mandates, which is why we had this astonishing scenario recently where David Nabarro of the World Health Organization said, you know, there's a time for a healthy debate about mandates when persuasion has failed, as though there's never a point where no means no. That you will be nudged and nudged and nudged until you're forced. And so I think that's part of the problem with me, that they think they know what's best for you. And behavioural science and nudges in governments want to create the model citizens. Because we didn't vote for them, and because we haven't been consulted on the use of behavioural science, because we don't know what methods they're using, we're being nudged towards something that we haven't defined. I don't know what their vision of a model scientist is. I want to have my own part in defining what a good person is. And this is the struggle of humanity to define the good life. You know, I don't smoke, but let's say I do. That's up to me. Give me the information about why it's bad for me, and then I'll make the decision. I don't want to be constantly nudged into what somebody else thinks is best for me. I mean, on the flip side,
that's a valid point you make, and I think this is quite key here, that there is an underlying ideology. There really is a vision of, there's an anthropology that goes along with this type of behaviour, right? That effectively, it seems to me, it's almost like people are almost like cattle, and it's okay to frighten them if you need to move them quickly in the direction you want them to go. But individual human dignity, the individual rights of the person, they're all forgotten in the midst of that. And it seems there is a view of the person and how they should be treated that comes along with this, right?
Well, I think so. I do think so. And I have an even greater concern, which it's just that I think that nudge is inherently anti-democratic, because what it does is strip away your rational choices and decision making without you being aware. And that's not the relationship I want to have with government. So somebody's taken issue with me, a behavioural scientist, if I said, yes, but when you go into the supermarket, they pump the smell of fresh bread at you to buy more bread. It's very different. I can choose whether I go into a supermarket or not. I can choose what kind of transactional relationships I have with companies, products and services. Big tech might be different, but I vote for a government every 4 years. I've never read anything in the manifesto about behavioural science, and I do not want to be subliminally manipulated by the government. That's not what I pay my taxes for.
Great point. I think a lot of this really does boil down to, at the moment, the big focus is on vaccines and vaccine mandates and all the rest of it. But really, initially, a lot of this was driven towards the lockdowns. And here in New Zealand, I think we have a very naive view of lockdowns because we're a remote, isolated little nation who we're actually quite lucky, low population density, where we're sort of at the bottom of the world. We didn't get hit too hard. And so I think we have this naive view where we think, well, our lockdown really worked, and those other fools overseas, if they just obeyed and complied, they would have been just like us. But in actual fact, lockdowns are never a zero-sum game, right? There's always a cost. And so much of this behavioural nudging was about really trying to stop people or discourage people from considering that cost and just getting them to stay home, right?
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't have done in Britain what New Zealand did. It's not possible with the amount of hauliers that drive into the country and being an international hub. It just wouldn't have been possible. The other thing about lockdown is it deflects away from the government. We know that a lot of serious disease and death was from hospital-acquired infections. Hospitals are now built like little cities. So, regardless of what we do in the community, you wouldn't alter the fact that people were catching and dying from COVID in hospital. And there is a lot of empirical evidence now from around the world to show that lockdowns are not effective. I know for many, the jury is still out. We'll see what happens. I personally think governments will fight like weasels in a bag, not to admit that lockdowns didn't work, but they were always going to come at a cost. What people forget is that lockdowns were not on the menu before spring 2020. They have never been in pandemic plans because they were not evidenced and they come with harms. The veteran disaster planner I mentioned before. Did I mention her? I think I did.
Yeah, you did. You did mention her. Yes, you did.
Yeah, she's features in my book a few times. She told me that for every COVID death, for every single COVID death, she would anticipate another 4 deaths over 2 to 5 years from lockdown-related harms.
Wow.
And that is the basis of the mortuary planning that she and other death planners do. So it was always known that it would cause deaths from delayed visits to hospitals, interruption to A&E, sepsis, oncology. I mean, there's been so many delayed cancer diagnoses and treatments, also obstetrics, domestic violence, suicide, the list goes on. And in fact, in this country, I'm not sure what the latest total is. I'm going to be giving you an outdated figure, but we were several weeks ago, we were on 70,000 non-COVID excess deaths at home.
Wow.
This isn't talked about. This is not talked about. I don't know why, because this is one of the epidemics we're facing. All the people dying at home, not from COVID. It's way above the 5-year average.
It's almost like a perfect storm too, right? You talked about, will we ever really acknowledge this? And politicians like weasels in a bag. I suspect they will recraft the narrative, and there's a convenient out, if you like, for them to be able to say, well, it always could have been a lot worse. Then they never have to prove that, but they can say, well, imagine what would have happened if we hadn't have acted. And also by the time the actual accountability catches up, it'll be several years, possibly longer, down the track before there's even a realization what was done.
Well, That's the kind of circular reasoning we see with models, with the modelling. The British government will justify the lockdown as having saved all the lives that weren't lost according to the modelling. It's completely circular reasoning. It doesn't make any sense.
In your book, you talk about things like you reference previous historical moments of hysteria, mass hysteria, the dancing plagues, the Salem witch trials, etc. I don't know about you, but how have you found this? For me, it sort of feels a little bit like being in I think you mentioned Black Mirror at one point in your book, but almost like being in a real world and very frightening social experiment that, quite frankly, I really don't want to be part of. The way in which people have just, it seems so willingly, complied.
It is really strange. And one of the things I've grappled with is this culture and ideological divide between people. So there seem to be people that really want to lean into authoritarianism and rules and paternalistic government when they're frightened. And yet there are others that want very much to protect democratic principles, their liberty. There's a lot of people in the middle. It's very strange to see how we're split. You see it on issues particularly like masks, which are very divisive. I know what you mean. There are times when it's felt like being in a gigantic Milgram experiment. What I find most alarming at the moment is the authoritarian tendencies that are arising in relation to the vaccine mandates. So there have been calls for vaccine mandates around Europe. Germany and Austria have already announced it. And I find this quite incredible, because if you don't have sovereignty over your body, I don't think you really have freedom. And so if the vaccine is safe and effective and you pass on the information, presumably lots of people will choose to have it. But ultimately, if somebody chooses not to, I think that should be their right. And this is the first vaccine for which we're not really allowing religious exemptions. And this is one of the signs of authoritarianism, where the state can exert complete control over you, the individual. Now, I know that churches and religions have said they don't have a problem with the vaccine, but I still think for people that should be a matter of individual conscience. There are issues for lots of people with stem cell research. The vaccines were developed using replicated cell lines from aborted fetuses. Yes, they're not brand new aborted fetuses, but it's a principle. For some people, that's an important matter of conscience. And I think that, that's just one of my objections to mandates, but I find that really disturbing. How would that look? So Austria and Germany have said they will mandate the vaccine. How does that look? Will those people be arrested and imprisoned? Would they be strapped to gurneys and physically restrained and forcibly injected? Is that the future of Western societies? Is that what we will do to people? Or will it be that they will be starved out? They won't be allowed into any shops anymore? Will their bank accounts be frozen? How do you force somebody to be injected against their will? Because it will be hundreds of thousands of people in countries, or millions and millions around Europe. How do you do that? And so I just can't keep my imagination quiet. And I think, well, how will that mandate look for the individuals, and how will it look for society? And I find it very sad and very troubling. And when some people think it's an exaggeration to say that authoritarianism and even totalitarianism is on the rise, certainly in Europe, and I think we could say almost globally, I agree with that. I think it wouldn't be correct to say that I live in a totalitarian country. I don't. In theory, it's a democracy, although there's so little political opposition, it doesn't feel like it. It is a democracy. But there are these authoritarian tendencies. And we know that these cycles happen in human history. And that's the part that feels like a social experiment, which is very unpleasant. And you're right, it does feel like living in an episode of Black Mirror or something, and you want to go, wake up, but we can't.
It's interesting. Speaking about the vaccines, one thing I've noticed, obviously, we're pre-recording this, and it's only a couple of days after the Omicron variant is sweeping the world, well, sweeping the news really as well. And it seems interesting. There's almost like a replay of some of the things that you talk about in your book and what we saw last year. And it's fascinating because one of the things I've heard, certainly here in the New Zealand media, has been, well, quick, rush out and get everyone vaccinated, despite the fact that at the same time we're also being told, well, with 32 mutations on the spike protein, we're actually not confident that these vaccines will actually do anything, but rush out and do it anyway. And or we don't even know how mild or serious this will be. And it seems to me that there's a question here about the media. So normally the fourth estate would have they would have had our backs. They would have gone to bat for the people and kept the politicians accountable, even when the political opposition was largely silent. But that voice, it seems, has been co-opted and been lost and actually just become part of a political campaign in all of this.
It's so strange. I mean, it's so supine. The questions that the journalists are past the politicians here are just, totally weak-kneed. They don't question the data. I find it incredible that we're 20 months in and data is still published without really being questioned. Recently, we had a case where the head of the NHS said there were 14 times as many people in hospital with COVID than there were in the previous November. And this was wildly, completely inaccurate. It was based on August data, not November data. And that's something that the journalists should have checked, not simply reported on. I think the thing is that the fear has infected so many people. Journalists themselves might be addicted to fear because, my goodness me, it does sell. Yeah. The clickbait headline sells, but also some people are caught up in the fear. I happen to know of somebody very senior in broadcast media here who said they would just like to force all the unvaccinated to be jabbed. So if that's the personal bias, how will that inform how they manage their staff and the editorial bias?
You've already talked about one or two, but what do you think are some of the key ethical issues at stake here? Because it seems some might be tempted to say, okay, Laura, yeah, this is a little bit frightening, but don't panic. We're very modern people. We won't make those same mistakes again. We're a lot more ethically and human rights aware now. But there are some big ethical issues at stake here still, even if we get out of this unscathed or relatively unscathed. So what are one of the two of the key issues, you think?
We copied China in imposing a brutal, completely unevidenced social experiment of lockdown, which has made people lose their jobs. It's caused business closures. It interrupted education. That generation will never get that back. It interrupted learning and development for young children. It caused people to die at home because they were too afraid to go to hospital. Some people will say there was still a net benefit of lockdown. Fine. The jury can be out on that one. At the moment, we are being ruled by government diktat. We're still under emergency legislation. I think we don't yet know how this is going to play out. We're in completely uncharted territory. It's a gigantic social experiment. It is an experiment. We've never done this before, so we don't know. I just hope that people continue to fight to hold on to our values. I think part of the problem with where we are right now in history is we've forgotten what our values are. We've forgotten our values and we don't treasure our values. For instance, when I talk to my teenage sons, they're a lot less bothered about this than me. I think that people have taken some things for granted. Last spring, I felt a lot of grief, and it wasn't for the loss of my own freedom. It was the realization that, in a sense, that had been an illusion for things to change so quickly. There was an illusory quality to them. So I feel extra committed to trying to consider really hard what our values should be and what sort of society we want to work towards being, and what we want our relationship with government to be and how we want to be governed. I mean, these are huge issues, but we all have our part to play in fighting for what we think is best. I don't like the embedding of behavioural science in government. I think there is something sneaky, unethical, and fundamentally anti-democratic about it. I think we need public consultations on the use of behavioural science by government, which methods are acceptable to use, in which circumstances, are there alternatives available, what's the ethical framework that the behavioural scientists are operating within, how do we measure the cost effectiveness, the cost benefit analysis, how do we monitor the harms? Because there are harms. Recently in this country, there was an all-party parliamentary group on the use of behavioural science to recapture loan charges with HMRC, that's the Treasury. And one suicide was linked to the use of behavioural science. How many suicides and what mental health impact will be linked to a campaign of fear?
It's interesting, isn't it, how some people, it seems to me, have responded and they've sort of said, okay, look, but we can't really have a society if we all just act like radical individuals. And there's a certain truth, we can't have anarchy. But then my mind always goes back to, well, you can't have a healthy, flourishing society either if you don't have community. And it seems a lot of these strategies, ironically, are actually doing more to atomize us into sort of radical individualism than someone standing up and saying, hey, we need to be concerned about the rights and the dignity of individual human persons in this.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not organic grassroots community, it's top-down community. You will feel like in a group and a herd because you will wear masks and you will stand on your doorsteps and clap to protect the NHS. It's not real community. Community is organic and it's grassroots and it comes from us. And I don't know where this mistrust of the individual has come from. Look, if it's dangerous out there, I don't want to go out there. I don't think as many mandates were needed as people think because people are sensible and they do want to look after themselves and their families and their community. Now, recently, my son got COVID and I did the responsible thing and did the PCR test to go through test and trace. By the time I'm called by test and trace, I've already called everybody he's come into contact with days before because it's a fairly easy, straightforward, commonsensical thing to do. And I don't even think his friends even need to know. He had it so mildly, we barely knew he had it. But I don't know what their individual circumstances is. Maybe his friend goes home to a grandma who's got pulmonary fibrosis. I don't know. So I do the normal, sensible thing, call the people, and then they decide what to do with the information. I didn't need a £37 billion test and trace to pick up those phone calls 1 week later after they were needed.
Do you have concerns about the science and really, I guess I would call it the co-opting of science, the politicization of it? It almost seems to me like this is a watershed moment where science itself, the scientific method, could come out actually very badly harmed as a result of the politicization and the co-opting of science for political aims like this. Does that concern you at all?
Yeah, the thing that I'm most concerned about is the deplatforming and the censoring of certain scientists. So we've had very credible scientists from top flight universities around the world removed from YouTube or kind of hounded in the media or even by politicians. There was an MP here who created a website with a list of journalists, scientists that he thought had got it wrong. I mean, the idea that a member of parliament would create a list of people guilty of wrongthink was really worrying. As I understand it, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a creative, scientists should be about debate and debate must be allowed to flourish. And it's about testing hypotheses. There is no, science shouldn't be dogmatic, then it takes on religious qualities.
A couple of quick questions to finish up with, because the book, the way we've talked so far, and the introduction I gave you earlier on, people could possibly be mistaken for thinking that this was all doom and gloom. But in actual fact, and I was quite impressed by this, the book finishes, I think, on what is a very sort of hopeful, positive, proactive, forward-looking note. So what are some things that you think we could do, perhaps, to improve transparency and create a more effective democracy in times of crisis going forward? How can we learn from this so we don't make these mistakes again?
Okay, so my recommendations would be, first of all, people need to get out of their information bubble. It's very easy to be a victim of disinformation, and I don't just mean from who you might think I mean. I also mean from mainstream media and even from politicians. It's good to try to consume media from different sources. I make myself do it, even though sometimes I hate it. Read news articles from different countries and from different partisan perspectives, because that will give you wider knowledge. I recommend reading my book, obviously, but the thing is that once you've seen the nudges, you cannot unsee them. One thing I love is I get loads of messages from people who've read the book, and they'll say, oh, I've seen this headline, or this politician said this, do you think it's a nudge? And I'm like, bam, you've got it. And that's the thing, that it's like smoke and mirrors. Once you've seen the magician's trick, you know how it works. And it doesn't take you in again. So that's really good from an individual point of view. So if somebody's really, been affected by the fear of the virus, that's a difficult thing to come back from. But a rational, slow taking in of the facts and the risks and reading about the behavioural science approach to it would be helpful. Another important thing is don't look at social media or news first thing in the morning. It sets the emotional temperature for the day. I do it way too often, but don't start your day with bad news, because then you set an emotional temperature. Also, people do have to come back to their own agency and their own power. People should be communicating with their elected political representative, their member of parliament, and telling them what they think about the rules. MPs do respond to heavy mailbags, even digital ones. They need to know how you feel. So politely, because they're human beings too, but politely let them know what you think about the edicts in your country, and the way things are going. And start watching the behavioural scientists. Look at what they're doing. Sign up for their newsletters and reports. Get a step ahead of them.
Do you think there's some practical steps that perhaps, or changes in government policy or behaviours, if you like, that would be helpful to us all here? That there needs to be a bigger governmental and even international conversation about?
Yeah, I mean, this is then slightly out of the terrain of my book and my field of expertise, but governments need more red teams on their advisory panels. There's quite homogenous thinking. I know from interviewing people who are on panels which advise government that they get shunted out if they're wild cards. They don't like those dissenting voices or those questions. I spoke to somebody who is an expert in their field, and they were taken out of a room and told they're too challenging. Well, yes, it's uncomfortable, but you need the challenging people in the room. Put your big girl and boy pants on and suck it up. That's what you're paid to do. So more challenge. And I suspect we need to rewrite some of our public health legislation so this can't happen again. Look, that's what I think. I'd like this not to happen again. I think we need a new Public Health Act in this country, but I'm going to leave that one to the lawyers.
Laura, the final word, and this is great. I love this about your book too. Was there was a word of caution, perhaps, for those who might think, well, I'm immune to the fear. I'm not like one of those sheep who's part of the experiment and who's conspiratorial, and I can see through the veil. There's a danger that we actually get corrupted by the fear of what's happening, right? And that can cause us to get into our own form of hysteria.
I love it. Really good point. So I noticed this myself right from the beginning. I felt frightened of the authoritarianism. So I kept checking in with other friends. I could think of a friend who's very intelligent, very rational, thinks very differently to me. I think I got lost in the end because I'd say, well, it feels like this to me. What do you think is going on? And I would check in with him, and I would read newspaper articles from different perspectives. And I'd constantly hypothesize, well, this could be happening because of this. But even if it's happening because of this, there might be this good intention behind it. And just try to check myself. When you're in a fear place, it doesn't have to last forever. It doesn't have to change you. So rationally check yourself. That's really important.
Laura, thank you so much for being with us. And look, I can't thank you enough. For me personally, I really, really enjoyed your book. I try and read a book every week or every fortnight, and gosh, I really enjoyed yours. It was like a breath of fresh air, and I think particularly for me, it made me realise, well, I'm not quite as insane as I thought I might have been in all of this. And so thank you so much for being here today and for writing the book.
Oh, thank you. That's really kind. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm really happy to hear it's being read in New Zealand, because I know my book is specifically about the UK, but like you said, there is so much symmetry in what's happening in New Zealand and so many other countries. They're all following the same nudges playbook. So, it can still help all the way over there on the other side of the world. And that makes me feel great. Thank you.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side, our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.